Everyone is welcome here, it's time to make new friends. Aquavide Uskaba, fill your Glencairn. Share a dram with the spirit of Edmonton. Luncha!
Good day, Whiskey Brothers, Whiskey Sisters, Whiskey Friends, and welcome to the Whisky Book Club's fourth book club this season, and that's season 3. And we're here with author Carlo DeVito, right there, and author of this book right here, The Spirit of Rye, over 400 expressions to celebrate the Rye Revival. And as always, I'm honored to have you, the viewer, with us here today. As a quick aside, I'm going to say there's other whiskey book clubs out of there, but none that will delve so deeply with this gentleman right here over 4 to 6 hours of pelting him with questions. Not very many out there that's going to do that. My name's Dolph. I'm the president of the Alberta Scotch Society. I'm the founder of the Whisky Book Club. I'm your host tonight. Really happy to be here. And if you want to know what the Whisky Book Club is, it's a home base. It's a safe place for whiskey geeks that love a dram and love to read about whiskey, really, or other spirits kinds come in there, but it's mostly about whiskey. So welcome to you all. This book right here again, right there. It's the 15th book that we've reviewed on the Whisky Book Club, and it's also one of several books that Mr. DeVito has done. I'm going to show you a couple pictures of others. Actually, I'll show you one right here. This is one of his other books, Single Malt Whiskey, and also a massive tome. He doesn't do small books, this man. They're not. They're thousands of pages and 20 pounds. You can defend yourself with these and let's show another book. We've got Big Whiskey in here. Let's get a picture. So that's a good looking book. How many pages in that? I should ask you before.
That's another 500-600 pages. It's another defense weapon.
Excellent. It's massive. So he's got that. He also wrote How to Hold a Beer Tasting, Jiggers and Drams, Whiskey Journal, 15 other books. He's editor of some very big names in the industry, my favorite being Michael Jackson. So I was really, really happy to see his name there. Not owner anymore, but he was
founder
of, and what was the name of the Vineyard winery?
Hudson Chatham Winery in Ghent, New York. We were the first winery to get a score of 90 or better for a red hybrid wine.
And what was the hybrid grapes then?
It was a Baco Noir, which is very prominent in the Niagara region region Canada. Okay. And some of my favorite Baco Noirs are up there, and some of my favorite wineries are up there.
Tell me the difference between a winery and a vineyard, please. Always wondered.
Winery is someone who, in the past, it's been interchangeable, but traditionally a winery buys grapes from growers around the region, and the bulk of their output is from grapes that have been sourced, outsourced, and made there at the winery. A vineyard, traditionally speaking, is a winery that has its own vineyards, and so you have what are called estate wines. And so vineyards generally thought to be estate wines, but they've become interchangeable.
And I've used them interchangeably, but I feel I've been wrong in certain times. So
yeah, those were the original concepts anyway.
All right. What do you got in your glass tonight, Mr.?
I have Stoll and Wolf. This is a 2-year rye. Really pretty. Stoll and Wolf, wonderful small producer in Pennsylvania. One of the original partners was one of the last distillers from the old Michter's plant before it had been closed down. So some tremendous knowledge being passed down through there, and they are making really exceptional whiskeys. We're going to talk a little later. I hope to make a point about Pennsylvania rye, so let's bring them up again.
Well, I'll try to set it up. What I've got 2 drams like I usually do. So I've got Redemption Rye. I mean, I've got some questions to ask you about that, and also Pikesville, and that's the one.
Classic, a classic.
And questions I have to ask you about this one too, and this one's at least 6 years old. Redemption Rye. I don't think we have an age statement on any of it in here. No age statement. That's all right. 46%, 92 proof. Yep, good. I like it. It's lovely.
Yeah, it's good stuff.
As I'm two-fisting everything, it's good. Now, we had a lot of conversations last week. I had 10 pages. We got through 7, so I was pretty impressed. But this question right here, I'm a math teacher, so this question really struck a chord with me. So I want to make sure it happens. So I'm throwing it right out there first. And I've got a quote that goes with it. And as you've figured out by now, you know I like my quotes. So boom. There it is. 1 bushel of corn weighing 56 pounds will make 31 gallons of a nice 8% ABV. But AG, and you told me last week, AG was all grain wash. So
all grain wash. Now, AG has become popular and somewhat necessary, not so much in the whiskey world, but it's become very popular in the, or necessary in the beer world, because especially these days, there have been a lot of co-ferments in beer making. So people are making beer with grape skins. They're making beers with fruit mash, like raspberry fruit mash or strawberry fruit mash. You can buy the pulped fruit in a number of different fruits. And so you're seeing a lot of these in sours and other beers. So when you say all grain, somebody knows that it's an all grain beer as opposed to anything else in there.
No, that's good to know. I didn't know it was a big thing in the beer industry, but no, it makes sense, especially with
it makes sense in the beer industry. It doesn't make so much sense to have to use it in the distilling, but it's becoming it's becoming more and more an industry.
All right, 56 pounds makes 2 cases of 80 proof fifths after cut, roughly 5 gallons of spirit. So I think this is great. Most of us have been reading whiskey books for a while. Know of the spoilage, space requirements, transport advantages, distilling, why we started distilling. I think this is the first time I remember seeing the math. So, and as a math teacher, thank you very much. Thank you, kind sir. And I'm wondering, do you have any of this that has to do with barley, wheat, rye? Or
no, it's pretty. That's a pretty general rule. Rye, I would probably say, is slightly less. It's a little harder to make happen. That's why we're talking about the use of enzymes, etc. So it makes a little. I think if my math is correct, I think it makes a little less. But the general rule for all the grains is about that same set of numbers. I went online and checked that pretty assiduously, and that was pretty much the range that they give you.
Excellent. And we're going to say his fact checking works because he's gotten the questions before we did this, so I think he checked before just to make sure.
I wanted to make sure.
Just okay. My wife's my fact checker in the background. If you ever see the little piece of paper coming across the screen, it's like, no, I did something wrong.
That's not fair. That's not fair. I don't have that tonight.
Oh no, it's fantastic to have a lovely wife in the background doing the fact checking for you. Well, and I think it comes a necessity because I'm obviously wrong enough that I need a fact checker, right? So it's good. She understands my failings. But one of your failings was not this. The other thing I really liked, and second question, which I need to make sure comes back in here, I wanted to comment on your the artisanal focus that you have in the book. So you'll have a book or a page devoted to an artisan. So I've long had admiration of the art and science within this industry because they seem to complement each other very well in this industry. And I guess in most, but I don't know if you think about it all that much. And I didn't think about this when you had Rob Grassi, who refurbishes and sharpens the millstones. And I never thought about this. I feel it's a stone. How much sharpening could this stone need? But it makes sense over time, and especially something, a grain like rye. They're hard little pebbles. And you've been around beer. I've been around beer too. When I make beer, I grab the grain, I eat the grain to taste it. You like to see if it's fresh, if it has whatever weird flavors. If you have rye's harder to crunch on, and you have to be careful. You'll break a filling or something with rye. So it makes sense that these millstones need someone. But I really like the fact that you focused on these artisans, bringing the art forward in the book, which is really cool. So.
Well, there were a number of these people. It was funny as I was going through the number of people I was really impressed by. So the millstone sharpener, Grossi, was fascinating. And the way I found that out was I was interviewing Steve Bayshore at the George Washington distillery. And he was wonderful. And he started telling me one of the big things was about Washington's distilleries. He had a state-of-the-art mill at that time, and I just casually asked. I said, "Well, how often do you have to change the millstone?" And I said, "Is it like every 100 years?" And he just laughed at me. He was like, "Every 6 months, it's got to be sharpened." And I was like, "What?" Which was absolutely fascinating. And here's a guy who's got about 30 mills that he sharpens their millstones every 6 months. This is a job. This is a full-time job. And I was just fascinated by that. And there were a whole bunch of people like that throughout the industry that had these kind of weird angular jobs. For example, Mark Meltonville, who I think I didn't mention by name in our last conversation, but he's that guy who went to Washington's distillery and said, "Oh, no, you're building the fire all wrong. This is how you do that." And he makes Tudor-style beer in England for the Henry VIII estate, where they have a dining hall. So he still makes the beer and the way they used to make it, back in Henry VIII's time. So you're talking about these fascinating people. There was the woman who started Empire Malting in Minnesota who left a 6-figure job. She was a young woman. She had I forget, some really expensive, sports car and a condominium and the whole 9 yards. And she just took it all and built her own kiln and malting floor in the middle of Minnesota. Really fascinating individuals. You have Stephen Osborne over at Stoutridge Winery and Distillery, and he brought back the old Foudre finish, which is a European style. Instead of doing a Solera with a number of small barrels, you've got a giant barrel. It's just this. I think it's 10 feet high or 9 feet high, and you pour in through the top and you pull out through the bottom, and you're constantly pulling out this whiskey that's got 6 or 7 different aged whiskeys within. And you're also blending at the same time. It's really, really beautiful. You've got the movement with bringing back Rose and Rye in Pennsylvania between Dad Tat and Wiggle and Wolf and Stoller, who I was just drinking this evening. They brought back Rose and Rye, which was the #1 rye used for rye whiskey before Prohibition. So they brought that back in their state. There have been other states, but there's been a real concentrated effort between those three, working with a number of their universities there to bring that back. Caleb Clyburn over at Peerless. Most people blend to fill holes in a particular whiskey or wine. It's just what you do. You say, okay, well, this one's lean. We want something a little fatter or something a little bit more lush. We'll blend them to sort of make up. And he does it completely differently. He says, well, if that one has lemon, I don't want something that has something else. I'm going to find the next barrel that has lemon. I'm going to put those 2 barrels together, and we're going to get a profile like that. That's completely unique. Nobody does that. And it was absolutely fascinating when you saw him starting to pair these barrels and come up with these really incredible finishes. So there were numbers of people like that. There's Drew Fox in Indiana, who started out as a brewer, then he became a distiller. The town gave him a neighborhood and said, please redevelop the neighborhood. You're seeing all these incredible people join this industry. Dan Wright of Wright and Brown is a tugboat captain when he's not distilling whiskey. Mai Nugent, who's a farmer in California, who's just an incredible political force as well as a farmer. You have the Whiskey Sister Supply in Colorado. These 2 sisters are now the biggest suppliers of whiskey products to the distillers, in that region. You've got the Leopold brothers, obviously, who came back with the 3-chamber still. I interviewed profiled Greg Metzi, who invented slow cut proofing. So there's all these fascinating people that have gotten into it. There were Navy SEALs who've started, it's just an incredible group. There's, men and women. I mean, it's just across the board. Over in Texas, you have Milam and Green in Texas. They're doing absolutely stellar product. Two women, they're doing absolutely stellar rye. So it's just a great world. There's just so much going on in it.
But I think you're getting kind of a taste of what I get, because when I interview the authors, this is really important to me, and it's what I look forward to every week, because super knowledgeable, super passionate about what you're doing. And when you're doing this and meeting these craftsmen, it's the same thing. You're meeting people that are super skilled. They have, and some of them, like the millstone, like Rob. How many people can do this in the country? Can we say a handful? Maybe. I don't know. So skilled, so specialized, but probably so passionate about what they do. So I'm very envious.
Absolutely. There's Colville out of Chicago. I mean, there's just so many people that are so unique and bring such a different level to the playing field. And yet you've got this just wide swath of people who are doing so many great things, and it's so much fun to watch.
Third question. This was the last one from last week. So here we go. I'll send up, and as you know, there's another quote. And here we go. Let's find this quote. Ironically, boom. Ironically, liquor was often the solution to dissent in the ranks. On a number of occasions, the troops received double rations of liquor to quell their dissent. Whiskey sustained the force sent out to put down the Whiskey Rebellion. And we didn't talk about the Whiskey Rebellion, so I'm going to ask you to talk about that a little bit. You're quoting Mark Boonshoff. So I've heard that rum was supplied for sailors, but not very much about soldiers, infantry. And I've actually heard way more about dry camps, like no whiskey being allowed in camps, much less them giving them whiskey to do it. So did these soldiers with the Whiskey Rebellion in the States, did they need double rations to quell the people that might have been sympathizing with the people they were squashing? They had a little bit of a guilty conscience, maybe?
Well, there's a long history. You asked a lot of questions in that, so I'm going to try to parse it out as best as possible.
You answer whatever you want. It's good.
Number one, rum was a part of the British Navy and thus part of the colonial world. Excuse me, what was originally what you get a ration of rum, and then after that, the Admiralty said people are getting a little too amped up, and so they cut the rum by, I don't know what percentage, by a decent percentage, and that was known as grog. Just FYI, that later became known as grog, which was named after the admiral who came up with the idea of cutting the rations with water. And so actually, from what I was able to glean, the British Navy actually gave up giving out booze somewhere in the 1800s. The British Army continued to get different, depending where you were stationed. But for example, if you were stationed in Southeast Asia or India, you were given gin, and it was cut with quinine water. And that was an attempt to stem malaria and other illnesses. So that actually continued up all the way through World War II. But today, I don't know that any of the forces are getting booze as part of their regular rations. On the other hand, the other thing too was in the British Navy, you would get spruce beer because spruce beer had the vitamins to fight off scurvy. And matter of fact, Jane Austen, two of her brothers were were admirals in the British Navy, and they taught her how to make spruce beer. And at Christmas, one of her jobs was to make spruce beer for the family get together. Excellent. So a little sidebar on that. For now, the Whiskey Rebellion. Whiskey Rebellion is very easy to understand in this way. The largest part of the Whiskey Rebellion takes place in Western Pennsylvania, near the Ohio border. Out that way, there's not much cash money being bandied about. In colonial America, maybe 25%, I think it was less, had quote unquote jobs where they were paid cash for work. Barter system was still very big, and many businesses were self-owned. So there wasn't a lot of quote unquote labor where I would hire you to do X. It was just not, we hadn't developed that stage yet. And in Western Pennsylvania, money at best was scarce. And so you bartered. That's how you got along. And while there was federal money and state money in or state money in Pennsylvania, Ohio was a territory. And so there was no trading of any monies at that point. What you did was you bartered. And so whiskey became an incredibly valuable commodity. And what Alexander Hamilton said was, no, that's money. You're using that as money. You're going to be taxed for that to pay for the Revolutionary War, because they had some sizable debts that they needed to pay off. And they felt that a sin tax was the easiest way to that was the least painful way to make the Americans pay for their own war. That's great, but if you're in Western Pennsylvania and you're a farmer, you had all this leftover corn or rye, you turned it into booze, most likely rye. You turned it into booze because that was the thing that was least going to spoil, and that was a highly tradable commodity. So the federal government said, no trading the booze until you pay your taxes. But it was ridiculous. I mean, the taxes on these barrels of, if you had a barrel of whiskey, it was something like 3 years' wages, the average wages of an American at that time. Those farmers didn't have that kind of money to pay those kind of taxes. So you can understand if you were here's a guy trying to take away your livelihood, and it's not happening. So at one point, Washington needed to impress upon the states the federal government had the right to charge these taxes. There had been a couple of incidents in Western Pennsylvania, tarring and feathering tax collectors, ambushing a couple of marshals, things like that. Oh, these little things. So Washington says, no, I'm going to quell this. But on the way out there, yes, there were a number of people who were in the army who were sympathizing with the farmers. They were colonials. This was still a citizen army. And so to try to ameliorate the situation, one of the colonels said, why don't we give them a shot of booze and make them happy? And in certain instances, they gave them 2 shots, especially when they went through troubled country, and there was more of an empathy toward the farmers. And that was not normal practice, but that was the practice they used. It worked. The army got out there, nary a shot was fired. Just the show of force alone made the farmers back down. How many paid the taxes or got away with it by that point? Who knows? But it was the point was made by the federal government.
So it was a guilty conscience, which is okay, and they made them happy, so that's okay. You know what? When you were explaining it, that's the premise of the Broadway show Hamilton, was it not?
Yes. Yep.
Right.
Yep.
Okay.
So it's all part of that. Yep. Hamilton was a fascinating character, but he was pressed with the job of trying to help pay for the war. It was a tough thing because everybody was happy to be free. Well, a lot of people were happy to be quote unquote free of the crown, but how many people want to pay for it?
Mm-hmm.
And if they weren't, they were loyalists and they came up here to Canada.
Right, and they went to Canada. Exactly.
You don't like it? Go up to the cold. Yeah, see how much you like it up there, buddy, in the winter. Well, that's okay. We love it. We got a lot of people. I'm part of that. So it's let's switch. Let's turn it over a little bit. So without giving away too much, because people can buy the book. Buy the book. But here's ironically. Yeah. No. We already answered this one, so I'm gonna go to the next one. So, but I do want to show you a couple bottles that I have because I had a couple questions about bottles, and here you already commented a bit about this bottle right here. So I picked this up last week for our show, but I decided it would be better this week. You spoke of this, and I believe that you stated that it's the closest thing to a traditional Maryland rye now on the market. Is that correct? So
it is and isn't. So that's a good question. So here, let me explain.
Yeah.
There were about 6 ryes that survived Prohibition, labels, I should say, rye labels that survived Prohibition. You had Wild Turkey, Jim Beam continued to produce very, very small amounts of rye. And then there were classic labels like Pikesville, Old Overholt, I'm missing one now. It's going to kill me now because it's a very famous one. Overholt, Pikesville, and I'll probably remember it later and scream it out.
I was going to say Beam, but you already said Beam.
I already mentioned Beam. Yeah, there's another one I can't remember the name of. Anyway, suffice to say, they were most of the ryes that were saved that were labels had originally come out of Maryland and were bought by Kentucky distillers and brought down to Kentucky. Yeah. By and large, those ryes had been made using a 51 to 60 blend of rye versus corn and or malted barley. So meaning that 51% to 60% rye. So these were softer ryes. These were Maryland style ryes. Even Old Overholt started, which had been one of the original ryes, a high rye, as we would call it today. Even that kind of went in that direction and had a slightly more sweetened palate in that period. And so those were 3 of the main ones. Jim Beam and Wild Turkey were the others. And those were the 5 that really survived. And Old Sazerac reintroduced its rye in 2007. I think they made 1,000 bottles. And I think the quote was that Jim Wondrich said, recently, I think they still may have a couple of those bottles left because nobody bought them.
I want one. You'll take one, I'm sure, if you could find it.
Yeah, exactly. Those were the ones that had survived, but they were in such small numbers. It was, it was insane. It was still, at that point in 2000, 2004, 2005, 2006, 2007, you were more likely to see like one of those bottles in the back of a shelf of whiskey, and it usually was a Dusty at that point.
Yeah. So that's the Maryland rye. So let's make the comparison between the Maryland and the Pennsylvania rye now, if we can.
Okay, so we're going to talk about different kinds of rye. So the 2 main different quote-unquote styles, they are not official. There are no laws about this, but these are the 2 styles that seem to have survived or are popular today. The Pennsylvania or Monongahela rye is a high rye. So that's like 100 to say the 85% rye would be considered more or less, or, some people get very pissy about those numbers, but the high rye is the Monongahela rye. That's the real spicy, bold rye. Some of it smells like pine needles. They're big, bold, beautiful ryes. The Maryland or Baltimore rye was always a softer rye. It always had a little bit more corn in it. It was still 51 to say 60% rye. Again, these are very general numbers. They're not specific. But just to give you a ballpark, it was a softer rye, had a little bit more caramel to it, a little more vanilla to it. Not quite as spicy a finish. The Christmas spice that people expect out of some of the more high ryes are Christmas spices, clove and lots of pepper, etc. On these other ones, you had a softer, more of a sort of vanilla gingerbread kind of feel to them. Okay, so those were the 2 classic styles, and part of that came out of the agriculture, which we talked about, last week. Whereas if you were in upper New England, you grew rye because that's what was left over at the end of the season. And as you got down toward Virginia and Maryland, you had a little bit more corn left, so you could throw some more corn in there and soften it up. And that's how you came to those 2 styles.
And that's why I had these 2 up here as well. So we have the Pikesville, the Maryland, and we have the Pennsylvania rye. But I did need a question about this because we could say Pennsylvania rye because it's 95% rye. But this is more MGP rye. as well. So NGP,
yeah.
and
So
we're going to talk about how they did the 95.
right, we're going to talk about that. Yes, we'll talk about that in a minute. Right.
But
Absolutely.
so two different, and the one you have is what type of rye, kind sir?
So this the Stolen Wolf. The Stolen Wolf is a high rye, and it's straight Keystone Rosen rye whiskey. The Rosen rye was the predominant rye. And what's really fascinating is that Stolen Wolf, a company called Wiggle out of Pittsburgh, Wigle, but it's pronounced Wiggle, and Dad's Hat, just outside of Philadelphia, north of Philadelphia. These people went to the World Seed Bank, and you literally get a small packet of seeds, and you have to replace them from whence they came. So they give you something like 18 or 36 seeds, and from that you'll work with a university. They continue to populate the seeds until you have enough to plant an acre, 2 acres, what have you, and then you start rolling that into bigger and bigger numbers. And so, and you have to replace those seeds, as I said. You have to replace them with pure copies, as it were. And so Herman over at Dad's Hat was one of the big people to push this. Worked with one of the universities on the eastern side of the state, and Wiggle and Stolen Wolf worked with one of the universities on the western side of the state. They both started growing Rosen rye and bringing that back. And so now this Stolen Wolf is 100% Rosen rye. It's a really soft in the front, but it does have that sort of big pop at the end. Mm-hmm. It's just a gorgeous thing. And there's you get a little bit of grassiness in there, but you also get that caramel and that vanilla that you're hoping for. And you get that big shot of spiciness, which is just absolutely fantastic. So this is one of those things where certain parts of the craft industry have been trying to recreate some of the pre-Prohibition whiskeys, or bringing back those styles or concepts. And so Pennsylvania, these 3 small craft distillers have really pushed this Rosen rye thing, and it's really fascinating and fantastic. And they've really partnered with the universities, and it's really been exciting, and the whiskey great. So there you go, and it's something different, right? So this provides a craft distiller not only with just bringing back this piece of lost Americana, but it's also a great marketing tool for the craft industry. And so it's a great story.
Okay, so I do have a supplemental question to go with that. So, hi, Don, how you doing? And Vectron5, thanks for joining in. I just want to throw that out there really quick. Here's the question. So if they take the 36 seeds or whatever the amount was that you said, they plant the seeds and they replenish these seeds. They give them back. They're on loan, essentially. Mm-hmm. Aren't the seeds bastardized by the time they get back? Aren't they modified by the soil?
That part I can't lie. I don't know the exact agricultural thing, but I know that you have to return as clean a product to them as possible. Okay. That one thing I do know. So I probably comes out of the first or second round, right? As far as I could figure.
I'm wondering. Okay. I think that's kind of cool. I already did that. That's I'm also intrigued because we're talking about regionality now. So in 2017, in your book, you have this in the quote, 9 New York distilleries banded together, create a new iteration of rye, Empire Rye. So I'm wondering if many regions do something like this. They band together and they see that they have something unique and other than geography. So not just geography, but what they do put together, and they rebrand themselves. So is this something that's fairly common right now? Because
there are only 2 states that have an actual rye designation, state rye designation. The first of which was Empire Rye. They came up with this. It was a really unique thing at the time. It continues to be the predominant whiskey out of New York State up through Prohibition, up to Prohibition, was rye whiskey. And so they felt that it was important to make that quality statement. So to be an Empire Rye, which is the New York State rye, 75% of all the grain has to be from New York State, and at least 75% of the rye has to be from New York State. It has to be made, aged, and bottled in the same distillery. I forget I think there are one or two other things, but the idea is that you're getting a New York State product. It is a terroir-ish product. And those bottles are branded with a logo that you can physically see on the bottle, so it's an Empire Rye. The only other region to emulate this was Indiana, which of course at one point in the country's history supplied 70 to 80% of all the rye that Americans drank for a good, I think, 3 to 5 years. So Indiana has their claim, and it's a similar law wherein it has to be made, aged, and bottled in Indiana. Those are the only two that I know of right now. There may be legislation building in other places, but those are the two that I'm most familiar with.
So it is more region than anything else.
It's very regional. Yes, it's very regional. It's meant to be regional. These are places that have especially New York and Indiana, have an extensive history with rye and feel like they have a claim to it that's beyond just making rye. By the way, the other label was Rittenhouse. That's the other label.
Okay. Yeah.
2 seconds later.
You knew you were going to come to it.
I knew I was going to come through
at some point. And one question though, Pennsylvania rye, do most Pennsylvania ryes have the dill pickle flavor to it? Because that's what I get in a lot of them. But I don't know if it's those because they're MGP, and MGP products I usually get dill pickle. So I'm wondering if you
I was going to say I don't think so. I think that I have to say, just between the three ones I just mentioned, they all three have completely different flavor profiles. Especially the Dad's Hat, which you certainly are. They've got that big sort of rye spice bomb shot that is super, super unique. And no, I don't get that at all with the crafters.
Okay. All right. So just the big guys, maybe. Here's another one. Boom. Only a handful of American labels survive, such as they were, and I could have just read this for you to do the kind of.
That's all right. So there you go. I got it. I'm just glad I got it before you got there.
Thanks, Phil. All had been sold and were now being manufactured elsewhere. We already stated that. With sorry state of affairs, many of these whiskeys were referred to as bottom shelf. Now here's the thing, and I talked about this with Finn and O'Connor when we were doing a glass apart. I wanted to say a touch of class, but a glass apart. And we were talking about Jameson. We were talking about Irish whiskey. And we might have a reason to overlook some of these ryes as being too commonplace, just like people were stubbing their nose at Jameson. But I was thinking we really owe and Finnan agreed with me, we really owe them a debt, because without these guys over the 1990s, where would we have been with Irish whiskey? Where would we have been with ryes without these guys to bring us along and to kind of have that placeholder over time? And maybe they were fantastic, or maybe they just been doing it for so long, or maybe they just had a part of the market that they could sustain them and they were just getting by. Jameson's did fantastic, by the way, on their own, but these guys with the rise, I think we owe them a little bit and for other people to get back in the game. So
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, you're talking about Heaven Hill, and you're talking about Wild Turkey and Jim Beam and Old Overholt, Pikesville, Sazerac. I mean, these companies held on when everybody else dropped it. The rye got pulverized by Prohibition. Bourbon had barely come back and gotten beat down in the 90s. With the explosion of clear spirits like gin and vodka and tequila and all the drinks and cocktails that go with them. So the cocktail world had influenced that greatly. By the time the bourbon started to make a huge comeback, Seagrams, which was later on Pernod Ricard, and then later on whatever the heck I forget the Genesis. But anyway, you're talking about Seagrams was getting out of the brown liquor business completely. They had sold off almost all of their original distilleries that produced brown liquids. And even Larry Ebersol, they moved to several column stills or built new column stills at the final MGP location, just so they could keep producing more grain neutral spirits. So it was just a matter of the times, and people were drinking something else. And yeah, places like Wild Turkey and Jim Beam and Old Overoak, Jim Beam, Wild Turkey, and a couple of these other places kept these labels alive when you're thinking how many more people were drinking brown liquor. Not that many. People were drinking martinis. They were drinking Cosmos. They were drinking Sex on the Beach and, all these other crazy drinks.
Wine.
So it was, yes, they definitely deserve, but as they jokingly said, we spill more bourbon than we make rye. So that was
and that was the other point. Maybe they survived or kept making rye because they were in the bourbon industry. And I think all of them, if we look at the bourbon, and you probably know a bit more about this than I do, they probably have bourbon or rye contents in all of their bourbons, right? So this was
most do, a large percentage do, and depending on the distillery, and we'll get into that more later because I know you have a question about that. Some of the distilleries didn't make the mash like you would cook and say, well, we need 30% of this and 20%, and then put it all in a pot. They made the whiskey separately and then combined them later, whereas others made them all in one pot. So depending
very
on
Canadian like, which is
we're going to get into that because that's a very Canadian like. Yeah,
excellent. Where we mix it and age them separately and come on, same thing. And maybe Seagrams had a little bit of a part of that.
No, absolutely.
We're going to talk about your touchstones because you talk about there's two major components in Rye's comeback. So number one, we're going to talk about we'll talk about the cocktail culture later because that's huge, and that was really important to me and what I learned the most of right there. I like that a bit. But the other invention was the famous 95.5 whiskey. All right, so and this is a 95.5 whiskey. And so how did Seagrams, originally Seagrams, MGP later, so I'm going to throw their little picture up there again because it took a little bit to find that.
There you go.
So how did Seagrams have such an effect? So did history, mash bills, or the palate, like focus groups, get them to the 95.5 blend? How did they figure out that that's where they wanted to be with all of them?
So Seagrams was much more like Canadian, and Seagrams was originally very strongly linked to Canada in distilling. And so Seagrams was very much like Canadian distillers today, the old Seagrams. They made their whiskeys separately and then blended them later. The 95.5 rye was actually invented at the Seagrams research plant in White Plains, New York, and then was later brought to Larry Ebersol, who perfected it on a large scale. I mean, these people make 5-gallon pots and then they bring it to you. Not quite the same thing, So he's the guy who perfected it in a distilling setting. But that was originally a whiskey that would be blended with other whiskeys, and then eventually was sold separately. And that's a whole nother story, which is about the how Seagrams affected the whiskey world in a completely different way than it did before. Because up until a specific period, Seagrams never sold a drop of their whiskey outside of the bottlings that they did to stores and what have you. They never sold bulk whiskey to anybody. while it was Seagrams.
So let's link this now to your two touchstones of the comeback of rye.
Okay.
How does this have a major effect and like one of the two most significant events to change its comeback? Rye coming back into my glass, which I love so much.
Well, I think the cocktail culture really started to make a demand for it, and we'll get to that separately. But we're talking about Seagrams, so let's ride that ride with Seagrams.
Okay.
Seagrams was sold off before it became MGP, or no, maybe it was after MGP. It became something else, and Pernod Ricard had bought it. Okay, so they had two issues. Australia used to buy a ton of stock from Seagrams for the Australian market. And just like America, clear spirits became huge. And Seagrams Australia aged their whiskey at MGP. So there came a point in time where Australia said, we can't take all this bourbon that we've contracted for and paid for. We can't sell it. So they hired somebody to work out of the MGP offices, or relatively speaking, and he started selling off MGP stocks to other small distilleries. This was the first time Seagrams ever sold bulk to anybody. It was a very slow go at that time because there weren't that many craft distilleries at that time.
And is it Seagrams that's actually selling it, or is it? I think you said Fuller's from.
It was Fuller's. It was Fuller's who was actually selling it, but they were selling it out of the Seagrams stocks.
Got it. Yeah.
And then what happened was, I think it was Pernod Ricard bought Seagrams, and they bought Absolute. I think that's what Larry Ebersold said was the big final breaking of the back. Again, they were looking at all these bourbon stocks saying, we're not moving this stuff. And we just bought Absolute. We broke the bank to buy Absolute, which was huge at the time. Let's sell off all this whiskey that's not moving. And that was a huge thing because, number one, again, like a Canadian distillery now, for example, like say Crown Royal or any one of the big ones.
Yeah, Wiser's.
They made the whiskeys in components. They had a 95 rye, they had a 60-40 rye, they had all these different things that they would use to blend. And so guys like Dave Schmier, who started Redemption Rye, and his partner, got in touch with these people that were selling. Larry was selling one portion, and a guy named Dick somebody or other was selling the other portion. They somehow met through friends of friends and as business acquaintances, whatever. And, I remember Dave talking about they tasted rye, these young ryes, for the first time and went, oh, I don't need bourbon. I don't need whiskey. I need rye. And so that's kind of how that started. And you had High West, and you had a number of these other small craft distilleries starting to buy these ryes that had been sitting there. Matter of fact, who was it? High West had a Larry Ebersol a label, matter of fact, because he sold them 6 of his oldest barrels. They were like 20-something years old.
Oh, wow.
They were just, unicorn whiskeys.
Yeah.
And that was a huge, huge deal for them. But that was unheard of. So you had all this whiskey. These are some of the biggest whiskey caches in all of North America are suddenly being sold off. Mm-hmm. And now you have the rise of the craft distiller, and you have this new demand for rye that's being fed by the cocktail culture, and suddenly, boom! You can't get enough of this stuff. And of course, Whistle Pig started buying Canadian rye stock, and this starts to snowball. But up until that point, as I think it was Amanda Schuster, who's a wonderful writer, and Amy Zavato, another wonderful writer. They both had the same thing. It was rye was it was a dusty bottle sitting at the back of the bar that you waited for some grungy old dude to walk into the bar with a pack of Marlboros rolled up into his sleeves. They give me a rye, and people will be like, "Holy crap!" Once a year, somebody orders a rye, and that really changed things. That was a big game changer. Again, Seagrams selling off its stocks was a huge thing. Huge.
And I think that made this one. Well, and I'm just picking some that are 95.5.
Right. So Dickel survived Prohibition. It was one of the only two distilleries in Tennessee from post-Prohibition Tennessee. Only two distilleries actually survived, and those were Dickel and Jack Daniels.
Yeah.
Everybody else died, and Tennessee had one of the largest concentrations of distilleries in the United States. It had been wiped out in 2019. Was it 1910 or 1909? The Tennessee had Prohibition 10 years before the rest of the country. So the fact that those two distilleries made it through was a huge.
And it's kind of neat. They're both the charcoal mellowed, that one, and Jack.
Right, and that's Tennessee whiskey. That's a completely different argument.
And the old tub is not one that came out, but I think you mentioned Angel's Envy, though. I think they bought
Angel's Envy is a fascinating story. I love Angel's Envy. Lincoln Henderson was one of the most revered of the Bourbon Hall of Fame distillers. He had been at Brown-Forman forever. He, with a young man named Chris Morris, who is now the master distiller at Woodford, helped to create some phenomenal things over at, first Lincoln helped create Gentleman Jack at Jack Daniels, and then they went on to found Woodford Reserve, he and Chris, and then he retired. And when the craft distilling thing hit, so many people were like, Lincoln, you need to get in on this. This is crazy. And so Lincoln started his newest distillery with his son, Wes, which was Angel's Envy. And Angel's Envy is the epitome of the high-end bourbons. There's a whole, if you go to Scotland, for example, there's single malt whiskey, and then there's the stuff that's, $100 and more a bottle, right? And what the whiskey industry, what the American bourbon industry said was, you know what? There's not that level of product for the international market. There's a lot of, $20, $30 bottle stuff. That's hard to compete with in the international market. So Angel Envy was beautifully placed to be a great import as well as a high-end brand in the industry. And it was one of the first, actually. And it's made a huge difference in the industry. And that's a whole nother category that they helped create. So another gift from Wes and Lincoln Henderson.
Well, let's go Seagrams MGP. They've really helped out with the 95.5, and I've just been noticing it. And you know what? I didn't really notice it until it came in the book, and I read it in the book. Well, so now when I'm looking at my stuff and I see the 95.5, I think immediately, is it MGP, or I have to question it. And I'm wondering, is it mostly an MGP product if it's 95.5, or is
not as much as it used to be? And not as much as it used to be. Now people have copied that recipe or adapted it in their own way. So no, it's not. They've certainly perfected it. Larry Ebersol absolutely perfected it. But today it's fairly common that people who want to do that high rye can do it at their own distillery.
Good. Two more quotes, and I got two quotes, and I agree with them and disagree just a little bit with both quotes. So here's a quote. Well, when I say disagree, it's not really disagree, but here it is. It's just right there. That's the first one. So it's just as smooth as bourbon, but a little spicier, a little bolder. It's got that big woody tang that American whiskey has. You can say rye is to bourbon as Scotch is to Irish whiskey. And I want to say that again. You could say rye is to bourbon as Scotch is to Irish whiskey. So I like this. I do. You can find examples where it doesn't fit, because you could always find examples that don't fit. But what do you think about you're quoting Woodrich when you're doing this. So you agree completely?
I agree completely. There are two ways to look at rye, and I agree. Rye is to bourbon as Scotch is to Irish whiskey. It's the bigger, bolder version in both cases. The other one that I also agree with is rye is that stepping stone to Scotch. So you're going from bourbon to rye, which is bigger and bolder, and less sweet, generally speaking. Got a little less sweetness than some of these bourbons out there. And then you get to single malt whiskey that has a little dry, yet a little drier yet. And so rye is that stepping stone. I also agree with that. So I agree with both in general. There are always exceptions on any side, right? You can find some sweet ryes. You can find some spicy bourbons. Certainly, I love a bunch of Highland Scotch, and some of that can be fairly sweet. You got something like Glenmorangie, which is this lovely, lush, super smooth, almost cognac-like, whiskey. And then, God knows you can get to some of these Islay ones that are just, campfire wood thrown into your whiskey. So it's there's that flavor profile that goes, but I do think that rye is that older whiskey. You grow up, I think we were talking about this last week, you first tried sweet Riesling, and then all of a sudden you go to Pinot Noir, and next thing you know, you're drinking Cabernet Sauvignon. And I think that rye is that Pinot Noir.
Okay. Well, let's go with Cab Sauv. I like the Cab Sauv because a lot of it is wood. It's in wood. It's
a big woody, yeah. But that's the whole point, right? You're going through that.
And that's where maybe my disagreement comes, because usually Canadians, here we go. If you're into booze, they call it rye, but there might not be any rye in it when you're a kid. You have your rye and Coke, rye and 7, rye and ginger ale, because we're Canadian, we do that. That's what I had. But most guys that I know that are coming into rye now, and maybe it's because a little bit of my influence, they were Scotch people. It seems Scotch seems to be kind of the next step. They go into craft beers and they want something kind of newer, uniquer. They go into Scotches. And after that, they go into the high rise. For me, for my friends. But you know what? If I was in Eastern Canada and a lot of people into Wisers and these are kind of the first things they drink. And maybe they stuck with this. I gave it up at 19 because I got sick as a dog off of it. But then came back later, and that was my progression into Scotch, and then after Scotch, back to rye, and rye is my drink. It is. It's my favorite. It's not what I have the most bottles of because there's not that many. There's way more Scotches out there than there are rye.
Oh yeah, there's a ton of Scotches out there. No question.
But I'm trying. So
you're trying. There you go.
Here's my second quote, and this is from Dave Pickerel. So there's a cultural shift that's happening. The American palate is moving from sweet to savory. I agree completely. That means a move from bourbon to rye. Sure. And there's also a movement towards taste being important. I agree completely. You get all the foodies taking pictures of everything. It's good. And that means a shift from vodka to rye. So I agree in general about the shift of flavor. I'm not sure about savory to sweet. I don't know.
I think there's a shift from sweet to savory, if I may. And I think the other thing, too, is that, since Dave made that comment, you've seen a lot more high rye bourbons than there were before.
That's true.
And so now that sort of stark drop or rise, whatever you want to call it, is now a gradation, right? Because there were all these bourbons that wasn't 51% corn. It was like 60% corn, and you had like 15% rye and 5%, whatever there was. My math didn't add up there. Just so much. Anyway, you get the idea what I'm trying to say. And now you're seeing ryes that have a much higher, bourbons that have a much higher rye content out in the marketplace. And so now it's a gradation rather than a step, rather than a stark step. But I do see that, in my opinion at least, that you're seeing a slow rise, and it's also about age. And I hate to say this because you have to understand that the big whiskey companies have doubled their sales selling things like Fireball and honey and apple whiskey and all that kind of stuff. And the funny part about that is in 1906, the government did everything they could to get rid of that, and it's slowly worked its way back into the culture. But nobody from any of the big whiskey companies is going to complain because it's literally doubled whiskey sales.
Yeah.
But those people will eventually graduate to a bourbon, and then they're eventually going to graduate to a rye. That's how it is. When I was 18, 19, 21, and I could drink for the first time, I was drinking Spumante and sweet Riesling, and I was like, "Oh, I'm a wine guy," And you eventually wake up one day and say, "Hey, this is a little sweet. This other stuff's a little drier. It was better with food because my Riesling didn't quite go great with steak." So, so you sort of get these steps. It's, when you were a kid, you didn't like Brussels sprouts or broccoli or whatever it is, and eventually you wake up one day, you go, broccoli's not that offensive. I don't know what I was so upset about. So I think it's just about the maturing palate as you go through. I don't mean to make that sound condescending in any way. It's just kind of an experience of life.
I think as we get older, we kill our taste buds, and then we can adapt and taste things better. And let's say blue cheese won. So as a child, you tried blue cheese. It's just gorgonzola. It's just so much. But now that we killed a lot of the taste buds, I think, or numb them, you can taste it and actually taste certain parts of it, and the saltiness coming out. I think it's because we have killed certain things in our mouth. Where the kids, it's just everything's so live. But my problem was not going from sweet to savory. It was the term savory, and because I don't know if savory is spicy. I don't know if savory is how I would describe rye. And that's why I'm going to ask you, do you think rye is more savory than spice, or do you think spice is part of savory?
I think in this instance, it's a combination of, because I think, number one, rye tends to be less sweet than bourbon. Mm-hmm. So I think there's that connotation that it's toward savory as opposed to being savory. Okay. And I think the spice adds to that, saying, wow, this is a completely different drink than a sweeter bourbon. And so I think I think in the main, I agree with it in the main.
All right, good. And it's perfect because you're agreeing with it right at the end of the program, because we've hit our hour. And I got through the 6 pages. I'm really happy. We're all good. Everything's rolling. Perfect.
I was all prepared for the next section. I'll be ready for next time.
We are. Well, and we're going to go back to the After Drams. So Whiskey Brothers, Whiskey Sisters, Whiskey Friends, that's it. That's our third Whiskey Book Club edition second edition of this book. Third if you count the After Dram, which we did with Davin last week. We're moving our conversation from this. It's more formal because there's only 2 of us, to a more open conversation because there's going to be 3 or 4 of us. Hence, so come back. You'll see Carlo, our friend Davin de Caljumo. We might have Dom from Last Straw Distillery coming in with us. I invited him. I'm hoping he's coming. He was here on the side for a bit, and he pays attention. He's always part of the conversation, which is beautiful.
Oh, very cool.
And that's it. What else are you going to do on a Saturday night than listen to people talk about whiskey and drink whiskey yourself and watch us drink a lot of whiskey? So
I like it.
Come back 5 minutes, and if you never want to miss a part of this, you click the like, you click the subscribe, and we're going to see you all soon. So thank you very much, sir. And
thank you.
Cheers to you.
Cheers.
See you in a couple minutes.
You got it.